the way that I like to describe it is like my usage with Google, it just is increasingly turned into feeling like I'm consuming empty calories. It's like I'm just eating junk food and just taking down Diet Cokes and stuff versus taking in substantial calories. So that's been degrading over time. And then the second piece of the equation is people have had harder and harder times converting visitors into whatever their goal is, whether it's a user or a customer and stuff. And so people have gotten more and more aggressive on the conversion techniques with like massive popovers and all this like gated stuff, right? So both of those things have just fundamentally degraded the quality. And so I could do one of two things. I could search Google and then I could sift through 3 or 4 results, closing pop-ups and reading through terrible SEO, garbage optimized intros to get to the nugget that I want. Or I could just plug it into Perplexity and it friggin' spits out the answer.
My guest today is Brian Balfour, CEO of Reforge. Brian and I did a deep dive into how 4 of the best AI products grew so fast. We spoke about why ChatGPT is investing in custom GPTs, how Midjourney grew to 200 million annual recurring revenue despite an interface that relies on Discord, how Perplexity is competing with Google Search, and how LinkedIn collaborative articles combines AI and user growth loops to be the most underrated AI product. Brian is one of the best growth leaders out there, so I hope you enjoy our conversation. Consider subscribing for more great interviews every week.
All right. Well, welcome, Brian. I'm so glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I took your Reforge growth class like back in 2017. So super excited to talk to you about growing AI products.
Yeah. One of the cohorts. So those 2016, 2017 years were a lot of fun. That was the beginning.
Yeah. Not sure how much I remember. So I'm glad to learn from you again. Yeah.
That's just it. Well, interestingly enough, that's always the challenge in education. And we are building new product around that exact problem. So we'll talk about that at a later date.
Nice. So I guess we'll talk about growing AI products. So I guess we'll talk about the most successful one so far, which is, ChatGPT. So I think it came out late 2022 or early 2023. Like, can you share like some of the growth loops that kind of fueled its rise to 100 million users?
Yeah, I think ChatGPT is one of these interesting cases that nobody should try to follow because it's such a exception that if you do try to follow it, that you're very likely to fail. And so I think with most products, they all go through this sequence where you start with these non-scalable tactics that to kind of start to get traction and start to get some of that energy going. And then at some point, you do the delicate dance of transitioning to something that is more compounding over time, more of these like growth loops. I would say ChatGPT is one of these rare scenarios where they had such a, what I would call mind-blowing, differentiated like product user experience that they essentially went from 0 to 100 million users just by building a 10x differentiated experience. And that experience fueled a couple different things. One was certainly word of mouth, people talking about it with each other, but that also manifested in some other ways, like other versions of word of mouth, which would be people taking what they were doing on ChatGPT, recording a short video, image, sharing it to social. That captured like the media's attention, and then the media attention like continued to fuel it. It really was capturing lightning in a bottle around these things. And I think this is such a dangerous example for others to follow, because especially builders get in this mindset when they're building their own thing that they also feel like they have this lightning in a bottle. And in 9,999 times out of 10,000, that's actually not the case. And that's not the playbook. That's not the playbook to follow. Now, ChatGPT actually is shifting into a totally different issue set, which is that they grew so fast on the acquisition side that they now have to think about, how am I going to retain and activate these users? And a lot of AI products are actually going through the same thing, where the novelty effect of what these products can do really captures a lot of acquisition interest before people have really solidified the cement around what are those activation and those retention pieces. And so a big open question right now is how much leeway do these products have? How much time leeway do these products have to get these systems in place before people just get burned out and they don't even like reattempt to use the product again? It's actually pretty unclear, and ChatGPT has actually benefited quite a bit from maintaining just public interest and PR interest and releasing these big model updates and other components that have basically acted like a lot of reactivation loops to get people back in. But certainly underneath the hood, I've seen the data is like Gen AI products are retaining at a much worse rate than non-Gen AI products, but they have serious acquisition interest. So I know we're going to talk about GPTs. I think this kind of plays into that effect as well.
Yeah, like, just talking to real people, I can only be part of like a handful of group chats at the same time. So like, how many AI chatbots can I talk to, on a regular basis? Yeah.
Well, totally. So I think there's, as I've gone deeper on this space, I think in the AI space, there's this whole concept of input and output friction. So essentially with something like ChatGPT, there's how much input, how much effort do I need to go through to get it to generate the output that I want, right? And in ChatGPT's case, well, I actually have to give it quite a bit, right? Like if you've gone any sort of deep on prompt engineering, you understand that actually there's all of these crazy different methodologies about how to give it instructions, reasoning techniques, context, all these kinds of things. But the effort there is actually really high. And then there's the output friction, which is how do I take the output and make it useful in whatever it is I'm trying to do. And that could be totally different depending on the use case of ChatGPT. And so I think actually ChatGPT is on one end of the spectrum where both of those things are actually very high. And then when you consider something like GitHub Copilot, they're on the other end of the spectrum where there's almost zero input friction. I'm typing code that I would have to type otherwise. I'm actually not going through any incremental effort. And then the output friction is also very low. I just have to hit tab or some other key for it to like fill out the rest of the code. It's like the autocomplete. So they're on the other end of the spectrum. And I think that's probably why they are doing a much better job at, high retention users over time. And this is where I think GPT strategy, the input friction is where the GPT strategy for ChatGPT starts to come into account. I don't know if that's where you want to go deep on.
Oh, okay. Yeah. You mean like the custom GPTs, right? Yeah. Like they seem very interested in like building a platform, first through APIs and then plugins, which didn't really work. And now with GPTs. And I guess GPT to me is just like a way to save like a very long prompt. But is that where you're going with? Yeah.
100%, right? Like, so I actually, a lot of people have been comparing plugins and GPTs, but I actually think they were quite different. Plugins were about how to increase the capabilities of what the tool could like execute for you. And plugins kind of fell a little bit flat. There's like too many, the error rate on it is just like way too high. GPTs, the platform is like a little bit different, which is, I think it gets to, it's lowering the input friction, especially for new users or users who aren't going to get advanced, right? So rather than, learning how to get this thing to teach me a new topic or something like there's a bunch of like learning GPTs, for example, where you just like plug in the topic that you want to learn about. And then there's a whole set of sequence of things that it goes through to like teach you this topic. Now, if you just have ChatGPT, you've got to not only give it the topic you want to learn, but a whole set of instructions around how you want this thing to teach you, right? And what you want it to do in order to go through that back and forth. That's very high effort, and very few people are actually going to go ahead and do this. And so now there's like a learning GPT where I don't have to input all that. All I have to do is input the topic, and the rest of the prompt, as you said, is basically already written. And so I think GPTs is really just it's an activation and an engagement play for ChatGPT, like here in the short term, is to massively reduce that input friction that users need to get value out of the product. And that'll like fundamentally like play into retention as part of it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like I guess I'm a power user. I personally built a bunch of like personal GPTs. I tell it too much about myself.
Yeah.
And then
you're definitely a power user. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, but because I have all these personal GPTs various things, I probably don't want to switch to another platform just because I've saved all these prompts in GPTs that I use on a regular basis. So interesting.
Yeah, it was months ago, I was talking with Joff Redfern, he's the former CPO of Atlassian. We were brainstorming on this. And my initial take was kind of what you just said, which is like, oh, let people publish the prompts, in like a UGC way so that I can like save them and copy and paste them and run them myself very easily in the product. And I think GPTs was just like a better version of that, where as a user, I don't even have to understand what the prompt is behind the thing. I just add this thing like I'm adding an application, and I give it a little bit of information, and it kind of does, it sort of does the rest behind the scenes. So I thought it was a pretty good execution. It was taking the power users like you, and now they're trying to like layer on incentives like the rev share and all that kind of stuff to get you to like turn those into GPTs and put them in the store and let other people use them.
What kind of, I guess, what kind of moat would you call that? Is that like a network moat, or like broadly speaking, like what kind of moats do you think ChatGPT has with all these other chatbots coming up?
It's unclear. I think certainly they're using this specific case that we're talking about. They are using their 100 million user number to try to attract a bunch of people to create a bunch of GPTs and lower this input friction, which will increase engagement and then monetization, right? And because all of the other ones, whether that's a Microsoft Copilot or a Bard or others, are going to have the exact same problem we just talked about, right? They're built for a very horizontal, very general use case. And as a result, horizontal use cases, their pro is their con. They can be used for so many different things, which is their pro, but that also means they can be used for so many different things. And it's actually really hard to get a user to understand what it is that they can use this thing for. And I guess in pre-AI world, right, horizontal products solve that by creating these huge template libraries, right? You can see that in things like Loom and Notion and Miro and all of these other horizontal products. And so I think GPTs is kind of the same thing. And so I think there will be a question of, well, do these other general use case type of chat experiences, do they get enough volume? Do they get enough demand to essentially replicate, this GPT layer, or in the pre-AI world, like the template layer, to help people get activated on these products? I'm not sure yet, right? It's not really a defensibility thing in the world of productivity tools like Notion and Miro. Is really an acquisition and engagement mechanism that really helped accelerate it. But as you can see, there's so many folks that have completely replicated that template strategy to solve the horizontal use case problem in that world. And I think there's still a question whether or not like what they've created with this actually creates defensibility or not. I do think it certainly accelerates usage in the amount of data that they're getting and how they're using that for reinforcement, like all these things that I think everybody has hypothesized will be the real advantages to getting to model advancements and like essentially and eventually like AGI. But certainly, like I think that's the real race. I don't think any of these products are thinking about network effects like we did or other defensibility mechanisms like we did in the pre-AI world. I think everything that they're probably doing is being ran through an internal strategic filter on how does this thing, get us faster to AGI or not? Because the first person to get there is that's probably the ultimate like defensibility. That's the ultimate like separator. So I don't know. Yeah. We'll see. It's a different world for sure.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. All right. Well, why don't we move on to another product, Midjourney? So we talked about how activation is really important, but for Midjourney, like their entire user interface is based entirely in Discord. And even for me, it took me like a while to figure out how to even make an image, So I think you told us before, but why do you think they pursue this strategy and why has it worked out for them so far?
Yeah, I give a lot of credit to Nabil Hyatt, who's a general partner at Spark. He came on this podcast that I do with a guy named Fareed Masavat, who you've also interviewed, called Unsolicited Feedback. And we talked through Midjourney's strategic decision here in the growth model. And it's one of these fascinating use cases, right? Where one of the common pieces of advice, for early breakout startups is like, hey, you've got to choose a channel that has like low competition, right? Because if it already has like high competition in your space, you don't have like the resources or whatever else you need to truly compete and to truly break out. And this was, I think, one of those examples where Midjourney made a very strategic choice early on. Is like they chose Discord as a very strategic choice for some of their product elements and some of their distribution elements. And, Discord had a lot of growth, had a lot of users, but there weren't really examples of other companies that had built off the back of that distribution. I mean, maybe you could say a bunch of random ass crypto projects. I don't know if we want to count those or not, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. But certainly not a company that was getting to hundreds of millions of sustainable ARR like Midjourney has. And as Nabil kind of pointed out as we talked through this, there's like a few interesting pieces of this strategic choice. One, and I thought the most important one, was that Midjourney is very clearly a product that is easy to start with and hard to master. As you mentioned, you can plug in any kind of query where you're like, oh, I want, an image of an office background with, plants and a few posters, right? And you'll get something. But actually like nudging it in the right directions and getting it exactly, what you want, it has actually a lot of those deep capabilities, but understanding and learning those things, it's like really hard to master and would be almost impossible for either Midjourney themselves to educate the user base at scale themselves on how to do that, or the users just getting there on their own. And instead, what this Discord model really leaned into was this whole model where I'm publishing a lot of my creations, a lot of my queries, like publicly in these Discord channels. Not only that, is that there's very low friction to starting to collaborate and communicate with the other users about their creations to like learn on my own. And all of a sudden you've got this like user to user learning to happen. And so if you haven't yet, you should go into, they publish a lot of the Midjourney creations kind of on this like semi feed. And if you click into it, you can see the prompt behind it. And you read these prompts and it reads like a foreign language. You're like, what the hell do all of these things mean? Right. Mm-hmm. But that's what I mean by like, hey, this thing actually has really incredible depth, right? That is really hard to master. And that strategic choice actually not only allowed them to do that, but it lowered the friction for that user and that like community element to like really start to take shape in a really fast way. There were some other elements of this, like, Midjourney's early adopters were all like, there was like high overlap between that and Discord users, right? So obviously you've got to choose a channel where that overlap is like very high and it exists. But it also allowed them to, not have to worry about building a bunch of product surface area themselves to get these elements to happen. Just imagine what it would have taken to build those onboarding flows, build the chat interface, right? Build like the feeds, like all of those elements. It would have been a shit ton of work. And they basically offloaded that all on a different product and a different channel. And that came with some trade-offs, some cons. It certainly probably turned some users away. But what they gained, in response to that was, they focused on what was most important, which was building this model around, the best type of image generation and some of those other advantages that I talked about. And so I think that's probably one of the important lessons in here is I think a lot of people avoid early controversial bets like this because they're like, oh, I'm going to there's always cons to these early channels, right? And they focus way too much on the cons, what they're losing. And they don't really focus on, well, what can I gain from that decision as a starting point as well. So anyways, I think it's a very fascinating case. And if you don't know, they scaled to a couple $100 million of ARR with like less than 20 employees. It's just like such an amazing story and use case.
Yeah, they really focused on like what really matters, which is like the quality of the model, right? Like to this day, Midjourney has the best, realistic images out there, I think.
Yeah. And my bet is that over time, what they're going to now, that obviously they'll keep focusing on that strength. And so then the question becomes, okay, well, do I start to build tooling now that I have the best fucking model, right? And the most traction? Do I start to build tooling around this to add like even more to this product and other pieces of the equation. So it'll be interesting to see what they do next.
I think I read a tweet where they actually did build a web interface to generate images, but it's only available to like people who generate thousands of images already.
Oh,
so it's
really?
like very focused on, I guess they really kind of focus on the hardcore user to make them, empower them and then have them spread the word to the more casual people. Yeah.
Totally. And I do think that's one of the more, one of the interesting points is that they have, I think as things have emerged, obviously a lot of stuff has come into competition in the image generation space. Adobe's done a bunch of stuff. Canva has or is starting to do a bunch of stuff. And, I think where Midjourney is like really focused is they've leaned more towards the advanced users, the hardcore users. And that's like really where they've monetized. And I think there's like a real market there to the casual image generation space where maybe if I have that need, maybe I'm just doing that via ChatGPT and DALL-E or something like that. And that's usually how these markets take shape is like, you got a product in the casual user space, you got a product in the hardcore user space, and the strategies are different, right? But both can end up being really big opportunities. And I think Midjourney has really positioned themselves probably more in that hardcore user space long term. So they're almost like the new age Photoshop to, versus the new age Canva, just based on like, market segmentation.
Yeah, that's a really good point actually. Cause I was worried like ChatGPT can just put its 100 million users to force to generate images. But I guess Midjourney doesn't really compete there. So my expectation is they continue to go down the hardcore market, which is why I bet they take a bet on starting to build tooling around this. They probably have smaller audience, but higher price points. All these things that are kind of pretty typical when you target that segment of the market. Got it. All right. Well, let's talk about another fun AI product. I'm not sure if you use Perplexity.
I have. Yeah, it's replaced most of my Googling. What about you? Has it? It has. Oh yeah.
I still use Google out of habit just because it's available in the browser like directly. But a lot of times Perplexity gives much better results.
Yeah. No, I agree.
So I guess maybe you can share like why you like Perplexity more. Just it's probably people are less familiar with this product than the other two. Yeah.
Yeah. I think if I just talked about it from a user perspective, I think there's a couple of reasons. One is we have now been through years of essentially just the internet getting filled with very like low quality surface level content. And it's been this like giant game of telephone. The content marketing playbook has been, let me look at the top 5 to 10 queries. Let me aggregate a bunch of the stuff from those queries to like get back to number one and then rinse and repeat. And then other people do it. And so it's like this giant game of telephone where things just keep getting more and more watered down. And so the way that I like to describe it is like my usage with Google just has increasingly turned into feeling like I'm consuming empty calories. Like, like it's like I'm just eating junk food and, just taking down Diet Cokes and stuff versus eating something, taking in substantial calories. And so that's one piece. And so that's been degrading over time. And then the second piece of the equation is that because that's been degrading over time, people have had harder and harder times converting visitors into whatever their goal is, whether it's a user or a customer and stuff. And so people have gotten more and more aggressive on the conversion techniques with like massive popovers and all this like gated stuff, right? So both of those things have just fundamentally degraded the quality. And so for most of my searches, like this morning, I'm very into like trying to gain weight and put on muscle right now. Just like get a little personal. And so I'm like doing a lot of like how much protein is in X and like all this kind of stuff. And so I could do one of two things. I could search Google and then I could sift through 3 or 4 results, closing pop-ups and reading through terrible SEO, garbage optimized intros to get to the nugget that I want. Or I can just plug it into Perplexity and it freaking spits out the answer. But not only that is like, I can look at the sources that it's pulling from and in a quick glance, I'll like make a judgment call. Do I trust the sources that they're pulling from, or do I need to like dig deeper or prompt it for deeper sources? So that's why I like it like as a user. So it's replaced the majority I would say, the majority of my Google searches. And I think the additional part of that is, even though it's replaced the majority of my Google searches and it cites sources, I almost never go to the source itself, which is, which I'm literally using it as a judgment call on like whether I trust this, like whether I trust the source or not, versus going all the way to the source, which has its own implications.
Yeah, this is a very complicated ecosystem. Yeah, but yeah, like the whole SEO industry is like a bug, man. Like it should not exist if the product was good, you know? If you were just, yeah.
But there's some other things that need to happen. Like, so, there's a lot of like Google searches that aren't informational queries like that, that they take some other form. For example, if I was like, like one of the products we have in Reforge is called Artifacts. It's like the real work from operators. You can see like real roadmaps, PRDs, experiment docs, strategy docs that people have written on former things to like, get inspiration and elements, right? And, when somebody searches in, I would say like product roadmap or examples for a B2B startup, that's not a type of query that's going to work in Perplexity right now. Like, because I still want to see the actual asset, the actual examples. And there are types of queries like that. And so I don't know where Perplexity is going with their strategy, but you can't think about Google as a world of like one type of search. That's actually a bunch of different subcategories of types of searches. And I think there's a question of, well, each one of those categories is actually a ginormous freaking market. And so I don't know if you need to replace all of them to build a really compelling company. I actually think you could take a meaningful bite out of one of them and still build a pretty compelling company as part of it.
How, like, if you were the founder of Perplexity, like, how would you grow this thing? Is it just like people like yourself tweeting that this is replace Google, or how do you grow this? Yeah.
I actually think that's a really hard question. I think I was thinking a little bit about this before we chatted, and I don't feel like I really have a great answer. I remember even early Google days, it was like all word of mouth.
Yeah.
Right. That's like really how it spread. And then over time, one of their methodologies to essentially build habit and all that kind of stuff is that they just started taking over the entry points of where people would start searches, where it was like mobile or the browser or through partnerships and all of those types of things. And so there's possibly a similar, I don't think Perplexity is going to go build a browser, but it's possible actually that Perplexity wants to go down the partnership path. And we already kind of saw the start of this just this past weekend or last week, where I don't know if you've pre-ordered the R1 Rabbit device that was announced a couple weeks ago at CES, but it's like one of the new hot AI hardware things. And it looks like they went out and did a partnership with them to be kind of one of the default experiences there. So that's potentially, that's actually potentially a path, depending on what type of, are they really optimizing their experience for these like informational types of queries? Obviously they've got this paid plan, which they call Copilot, which I actually think the branding is freaking terrible, but because it's so confusing in the space. Yeah. Because it does not do what other Copilots like Microsoft's Copilot and stuff does. But that's very much built for like a research use case, helping you like go through multiple steps. So maybe there's like a multiplayer aspect to that at some point. But then I'm like, like what percentage of my use case is that? Like, am I really going to invite a ton of people in there? So I actually think this is an interesting question. I don't have a great answer for how Perplexity continues to grow beyond like word of mouth and partnerships of like integrating into these new places. It'll be interesting to see what they do.
I think word of mouth can probably take them pretty far. Like just like make a meme generator, their search results and Google's, get people to share it. It would go pretty far.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a limited window for that type of stuff. I think it still exists, right? But I definitely think the novelty effect of that type of stuff of, oh, look at this cool thing like AI built, generate for me, it's going to wear off at some point, right? At some point, at some point, the dopamine hits that we're getting from that is, we're going to fatigue from it.
Got it. All right. Well, let's talk about the most innovative AI product next. Let's talk about LinkedIn, which is usually behind the curve in innovation, but they launched these collaborative articles that I actually contributed to one, but yeah.
Oh, you did? Let me ask, why did you contribute to one?
Well, it asked me some questions about like, like you're recognized as an expert in like product management, like you should go contribute to this article. And I went there and like some of the answers were terrible. Just random people, like really terrible answers. So I was like, oh, I feel I need to actually correct these answers. So then I fix it. Yeah. So that's why I put my stuff in there.
Yeah. It's hilarious. That was like the motivation to get you to contribute. Yeah. Look, I think if you haven't looked at this, I actually, we've always said in Reforge that LinkedIn they're just like masters at this whole concept of layering on growth loops into their product. And this is another great example of it. I think where a bunch of people basically just went and started generating a bunch of, content almost completely written by an LLM to like rank for SEO and all those other pieces, which LinkedIn could have very easily done and probably would have gotten positive results from that. They looked at it slightly different and they said, well, I'm going to use the LLM to solve the cold start problem on content. I'm going to have it generate the outlines and some like intro paragraphs to common questions, that to rank in results. But then what I'm going to do is I'm going to get our users to basically add their thoughts on top of these sections of the article. So it's like kind of mixing this AI generated content with this user generated content. And what that does is a bunch of things. One is that it adds unique content to the overall article, and therefore it's going to like rank much higher. It's going to rank much higher in SEO. It also gives them this opportunity to refresh the content automatically. So if they see something dropping in the rankings, all they have to do is bump this shared article in their algorithm, to get more people to contribute, to add like more unique, like more fresh stuff. There's like all of these components to it that I think make it really interesting from a growth dynamic perspective. And as a result, like if you go to like any of the SEO tools, the traffic on these pages is just like is like one of the most up into the right curves that I've ever seen, especially for SEO, which usually takes a long time to bake, right? Like that's one of the major cons. And that has not been true for this. And so it's been amazing from that perspective to see how they've like used this to create kind of this new hybrid type of growth loop. But I think the question is like, you're right. Like most of the content I've seen, it is crap. It isn't good at all. And so like what happens to here? Cause like crap just feeds more crap, right? Like especially when you're talking about Gen AI models, you like garbage in, garbage out. And so, but maybe they'll come up with techniques to identify, the needles in the haystack, the high quality stuff, like do more with it. I don't know. But from a growth perspective, I thought it was pretty fascinating.
They also have this additional incentive where, if you contribute to enough of these articles, you get like a badge, you get like a top thought leadership voice badge.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, they're playing the like gamification mechanics, to a T on this one to get people people to participate. So it's interesting. And then this other thing that they've launched, which I think is still only available for premium users, is they have launched like a chat, like an assistant experience. And then in the feed, they auto generate these questions below the feed items. And you can click on it and it auto opens the assistant and feeds it to the LLM and stuff. And it's an interesting, I played around with it at the beginning when they first launched it, but I have not used it like since. But I think it's an interesting example of, I think a lot of these products are launching these chat experiences, these assistant experiences. And what I've seen is that they get a lot of one and done users. People use the chat once and then don't come back to it. A lot because of like the novelty effect. They don't really, going back to the original problems we were talking about earlier with like ChatGPT. And so what LinkedIn is exercising here is another really interesting growth lesson, which is what we call like environmental triggers in Reforge, which is they're finding surface areas in the product that already has eyeballs, and they're generating like very low friction, one-click triggers to get people into like the AI experience. And their method of doing that is like they take a LinkedIn post that might be a little bit long, and then they add these like one-click triggers at the bottom, which is like, what are the top 3 points out of this long post, right? It's like stuff like that. So, it's interesting to watch this team, play around with this stuff and kind of see like what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah, I haven't seen the assistant feature. I think LinkedIn's growth team knows their shit. They clearly know what they're doing. They gotta, maybe their strategy is to just embrace the cringe, just embrace the cringe on the platform.
Well, for sure. Like I think, LinkedIn's business model is baked on, I need to get people back to the platform, submitting as much profile data as possible because I'm going to go sell that data to recruiters, salespeople, advertisers in various forms, in various tools. That's the whole business model. So at some point, like they don't really care. They don't really care about the quality of this content and stuff if it's generating engagement. They really only care about the quality of your profile data because that's what they're selling. That's what they earn their dollars on.
Yeah, it's actually really brilliant for a social network. I think it's very diversified. Yeah. I guess just to wrap up with one question, like what are your thoughts on this whole, AI wave overall? You think it's like, and also like, how do you think it'll impact growth as this, but kind of broad, but yeah.
I think it's very powerful. It's probably a more powerful shift than I lived through, like the shift to mobile. I think it's actually more powerful than that long term. And so I am definitely on the like pro side of it, the very much like optimist side of it and in creating opportunity. And so I think from the growth perspective, I have a few thoughts. One is I think there are growth opportunities in chaos. So when like something gets thrown into the mix and chaos is created, like usually these arbitrage, these new opportunities really emerge, right? And that creates opportunities for non-incumbents, the upstarts to find these opportunities and like and really leverage them. And I think we're going to certainly see that and are seeing that. And we are seeing that to a degree. I think it takes some of the old methodologies like content and stuff, and in the short term makes them better by making them more efficient. But I think in the long term will basically render them useless. So I think like some of these effects are going to go through like a whiplash essentially, where they're positive at first and then very negative overall. And I think as that happens, and as the novelty effect of AI like wears off, I think all of these products are going to be very much shifted into, I think right now, basically what you do is you can launch an AI product, you can call it AI, you can like name it AI features, like all that kind of stuff. And just doing that gathers like a lot of interest, but that's going to go away at some point. And as a result, people are going to start to have to like shift to solving other problems, whether that's around activation, retention and engagement, figuring out how to position and communicate, differentiated value props without, using AI as the differentiator. Because at some point, almost like every single product is going to be AI powered to some degree. And so it's almost like this opportunity where you can take advantage of some of these short-term things, but at some point, it all ends up regressing back towards like the foundational things, the foundational lessons in growth.
Yeah.
Like, how do I position? How do I communicate clearly? How do I find arbitrage opportunities? Like all of those things that are sitting at the core foundation. Like that's where this all kind of regresses back towards at some point.
Yeah, like how do I retain users? That's kind of important in the AI world. Yeah,
it's funny we're in this period where it's not the most important thing, but it will be over the long term. It 100% will be over the long term.
So I want to give you a chance to talk about like, does Reforge have any great AI courses coming up, or how do people learn more about this stuff in the right way?
Yeah, we do. Yeah, if you're a product manager in growth, marketing, this is like where we really specialize. We have multiple different courses on AI, depending on what angle you're coming at it from and what you're building. So definitely check that out. We also have a bunch of specialty courses around things like marketplaces, networks, as well as your core topics, product strategy, product leadership, where, we're talking about how AI kind of affects those things in the grand scheme of it. I would also, as I mentioned before, Fareed Masavat and I have this podcast called Unsolicited Feedback. We're taking a bunch of these new products and new launches. We're breaking it down. We're kind of giving our own take, our own unsolicited feedback on those things. So definitely check that out. And if I get any spare moment from my kids and work life, I will eventually get back to blogging on my site at brianbalfour.com. So no promises on actual dates, though.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, Brian. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Peter.